there's obviously a value proposition for the use of AI in drug development and in clinical study technologies, by which I mean the technologies that we use to carry out clinical trials, whether they're patient-facing technologies that make it easier for people to participate in a study, maybe by doing some things at home instead of having to go to the hospital, or whether they're back-end things like maybe an AI system that is used to check the data that's coming in from different sites to make sure that the physicians there are using a particular device properly, right? So that we're not getting irregular readings or showing a pattern that's a bit strange, maybe using some AI to look for that. I'll talk about the EU AI Act research exemption, and then looking at questions about whether, once we start looking at the other regulations, to what extent they kind of end up putting us in the same kind of framework as if we didn't have the AI Act exemption in the first place, to a degree. And I've listed some that I'll look at, but I won't go into that right now. So our value proposition, accelerating the discovery of druggable targets, finding new potential drugs, speeding up our data analyses, speeding up the time, decreasing the time that we need to get a drug into people, after all the testing, and then improving the trial experience for patients. So I'm going to take it as a given that we think there's a lot of value there. So starting off then with the AI Act research exemption, and Kate already showed you some of the language here in Article 2.6. So the regulation does not apply to AI systems or AI models, including their output, that are specifically developed and put into service for the sole purpose of scientific research and development. And there's a recital that goes with it. And for those of you who are maybe less familiar with European regulations, we have the main terms, right? But then we have these recitals, which are super important and shouldn't be neglected. You should know your recitals as well as you know the main part of the Act to really understand how the Act is likely to be interpreted, or the regulation is likely to be interpreted. So here, there's a lot of discussion about the regulation should support innovation, respect freedom of science, not undermine R&D, and that's the rationale for this exemption. So also in Recital 25, though, we have the idea that I'm reading this over again, just thinking about what to emphasize here. Your AI systems used for R&D should remain subject to the provisions of the regulation if they are then going to be used in other ways. Okay, so this is really important. That exemption is actually kind of narrow, because if you are going to develop an AI technology in the course of your clinical trial and then want to use it as part of your commercialization plan, you're not under the exemption anymore. So you need to think about this in advance. You need to try to anticipate, is my AI technology going to be something that I feel 100% confident will only ever be used for research? If not, go down the other pathway and treat it as if covered, even if maybe eventually you won't use it. An example here would be if you're doing a companion diagnostic as part of your drug development program. You want to have an AI-enabled software companion diagnostic product, okay? And that will, if it's successful, you're going to want to put that on the market with the drug, okay? So just as sort of a caveat and a warning there. So we've got some industry comment on the Act that I find pretty interesting. This comes from the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, FPA. And they've got a statement on the AI Act on their website. And they say, first of all, they're very happy about the AI exemption for the AI Act exemption for AI dedicated to scientific research. But then they've got a following on statement, which is kind of interesting. They say that if the exemption were not to apply, then the majority of uses of AI in medicine R&D will be considered low risk. Limited risk, rather, is the right term, rather than a high risk system under the AI Act. And that's interesting to me, because I think probably the best way to interpret this statement is to say, well, we're talking about situations where something's used in research and it may be used commercially as well, right? That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at this statement is to say, maybe they're worried that somewhere along the line that the research exemption is going to get challenged and narrowed through guidance, which we've seen happen under the GDPR, where we all think that we've got certain exemptions under an act or a regulation, and they get narrowed and narrowed and narrowed as it goes through the regulatory guidance process. I'm not sure, what the intent was here, but the point is that FPIA is saying, well, we're going to be in the limited risk world, not the high risk world, except for the situations that Kate pointed out. So medical device and triaging and anything else that might be listed from time to time in Annex 3. All right. So let's assume, though, that we are in this universe where we think we fit under the exemption. Okay. We're like, all right, one less regulatory burden, right? To an extent, right? So when we're working on our clinical trials in Europe, we are going to be thinking about our big picture frameworks, our clinical trials regulation, okay, which applies to all studies. And then we're going to be looking at the mandatory guidelines, the ICH guidelines, particularly the guideline on good clinical practice, which is in the process of being updated. We'll be looking at European Medicines Agency guidance. We'll be looking at the GDPR, which always applies. Because the data that we collect, probably most of the people in the room will be aware, but the data that is collected in the clinical trial will have a code number applied to it and basically the patient's name removed before it goes to the pharma company for analysis or any of the service providers in that ecosystem for analysis, and that counts as pseudonymized personal data. And then also there'll be supplementary national data protection and health laws, and Kate has just given some great examples of those in Ireland. So, good. Okay, so looking at the clinical trials regulation first, it's a comprehensive law, as I said, that governs all clinical studies in the EU. And it has a number of features that you'll recognize. If you've started making your way through the AI Act, you're going to recognize some of these things. Transparency. There's a very high standard for giving participants information before they consent to participate in a study. Conditions on data reuse. There's a section that talks about asking people for their permission to reuse their data for future research. And that's a really important part. For those of you who are very GDPR focused, we could interpret that as ethical consent as opposed to consent as lawful basis for processing. But a lot of times it ends up sort of collapsing into each other, and we end up treating it as a GDPR lawful basis of consent driven by the clinical trials regulation. And of course, consent to future research is freely revocable. And so, this is something that we need to think about in the context of our AI development, ensuring that the AI solution that's being developed, maybe using clinical trial data, is if it's one that kind of ingests and holds on to and remembers data, that there's a meaningful way for people to exercise their right to revoke their consent. And all of the processing remains subject to the GDPR, and that's expressly stated in the clinical trials regulation. We've got the ICH guidelines on good clinical practice, which I mentioned are being updated. So we expect, we know from the drafts, that it will include developments in technology and the newer approaches to conducting clinical trials, so decentralized clinical trial technologies. We have a consultation draft, we have part of it in any event, revision 3, and it has detailed requirements for computerized systems. It's got provisions about the quality of data outputs being ensured by design, testing, validation, and audits. If this is starting to sound like AI Act, I think they're right. Security requirements, and then we have recording requirements. So if there's an incident with potential impact on the quality of the data outputs, it has to be recorded and reported. Now, that's driven primarily by scientific reasons, right? It's very important to the clinical trial regulators, the health authorities of the countries, looking at data that's being used to support an application to put a drug on the market, to feel really comfortable that we understand that the data has been generated correctly, right? And so we have this recording and reporting to the health authorities requirement here. And then Annex 2 will have Revision 3 will have a second part, Annex 2. We don't have a draft yet, but we anticipate it's going to cover decentralized clinical trials, so those like more patient-facing devices and the use of AI. And that will be great to see for the industry. Okay, then EMA guidance, just wanted to touch on that as well. So we've got a consultation draft from the EMA, which is the regulator that is going to make decisions about whether or not your drug can be put on the market in Europe. And they have a consultation draft on the use of AI in the medicinal product lifecycle. And it's really worth a read. Anyone in the industry should have a look at that. It's not final yet. We'll see what comes out. But once it's finalized, it will eventually form the basis for formal guidance, and the formal guidance will be effectively mandatory. So key points: it supports a risk-based approach to AI, again, similar to the AI Act. And also it requires that the person applying for the drug, the company applying for the right to put the drug on the market, is responsible for ensuring that the AI tools it uses are fit for purpose and meet ethical, technical, scientific, and regulatory standards per GXP, so that's GCP and good manufacturing practice, all of that, and EMA scientific guidelines, which may be stricter than the standard practice in the field of data science. So there's even some chance that once we have all of these guidelines, we might have a slightly tougher set of requirements than we would have under the AI Act as limited risk system. Okay. So I'm going to skip the slide on highlighting the reflections other than just the key points in bold. Explainability, documentation and controls, regulatory inputs, transparency, and then additional scrutiny for precision medicine, which means effectively techniques driven AI technologies that are driven by kind of specific genetic mutations, etc. For precision medicine. All of those things are going to be under additional scrutiny. So if you just look at this, you'll see we're starting to move closer and closer to the AI Act, despite the research exemption. Okay, and then we have GDPR as a guardrail. I think most of the people in the room are probably familiar with it, so I'm going to save time on that. And skip over, and we can have a little more time for questions after we talk about national laws and frameworks. So the GDPR permits and pretty much requires the member states to legislate further in certain areas, including health. So as was mentioned in the earlier session, you've got to think about medical confidentiality laws. We've got to think about Data Protection Authority-approved frameworks for processing data in connection with clinical studies, for example, the one in Spain. And then we have France, et cetera. And I understand from the earlier session, we have one coming up in Poland as well. So these are all the things we'll think about and, that will create guardrails around this.